To you,
Welcome back.
Nicole. Thank you. It's a pleasure. And thank you, Ashley and Jen and everybody with My Health Angel. And I'm starting to recognize most everybody on the call. So it's good to see everybody. And Nicole, you always make me want to work on my hair and my glasses. I need to step my game up. You got game. You got game. So, all right, I'm going to share screen and then tell you a heck of a story. Boom, there we're sharing it. Let me make it full screen for everybody and full screen mode. Okay. So this is my most recent book, number 46. It just came out. So it still has the new car smell, still warm, hot off the presses. It's a very difficult story. So let me frame it this way, and then I'll share the story with you. So I've been a professor now for 31 years, and I didn't want to be a narrow historian that only wrote on one leader or one year or one war or one event. I wanted to write on everything. So at the beginning of my career, I like a nerd, I made a list of everything I wanted to do. I wanted to write on George Washington, the Revolutionary War. I wanted to write on Lincoln. I wanted to write on Truman. I wanted to write on the Holocaust. I wanted to write on World War II. Check, 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 check. I wrote all those, but I always wanted to write a book on the Civil War. But it took me, 28 years or more, 29 years before I came up with a topic. The reason being is entire forests have been felled to fill the pages of books on the Civil War. And I didn't want to just repeat or rehash something. I wanted to try to cover some new ground and dig up a story that history has missed. So it took me forever to find the story, and I finally found it, and here we are. It's a story about the largest prison break in American history. It's a story about one of the most bold and creative and successful prison breaks in world history. It's a story about one of the most infamous and notorious and wretched prisons in American history and of the Civil War. So that's the story that we're going to share with all of you. Now, I don't know, are you like me? How many of you love prison escape stories and movies, right? Don't we all read those books and movies? Love them. Anybody like Papillon? I don't know if I'm dating myself, but Steve McQueen, right? Dustin Hoffman. Great movie, great movie. Jen, Ashley, and Nicole, you're way too young to remember this one. So Papillon, great film. What about Shawshank Redemption, the book and movie? Anybody? Great book, great movie, and one of my all-time favorite books and movies, The Count of Monte Cristo. Love that one. So I love these prison escape, prison break movies, but here's what I especially like. Prison escapes when they claim that the prison is escape proof. As soon as they start saying no one can ever escape, of course, they're jinxing themselves, right, everybody? Then everybody escapes. So here's a handful of some of the great prison escapes from history. And then I'll tell you one that I think is the greatest. Father Gerard, that was from the Tower of London in the late 1590s. Britain, the British Isles at the time, as was so often the case, was a struggle between Protestants and Catholics. No love lost, and just basically a war. At the time, this is the Elizabethan era, so it's Protestant, and Catholics were being persecuted. Father Gerard was a priest, Catholic, obviously. He was charismatic, he was beloved, and he was political. So he was basically public enemy number one. He was arrested and he was put in the Tower of London. And for an 8-year period, he was tortured, burned, his hands were broken, just horrific things. However, Father Gerard was so charismatic that the guards came under his spell, and they helped him get word out. His supporters managed to get a rope that was strung from the top of the Tower of London across the river for him to get out and escape. As he's getting ready to do this, he tells the guards, of course, if I escape, they're going to think you're complicit. And Elizabeth and her minions were psychopaths. So you're going to be killed or tortured. So the guards had to escape with him, and they made it, and he made it away. So that was a great escape. Napoleon's escape from Elba. So the little emperor was captured in 1814 after terrorizing Europe for a decade or so. And only Napoleon could do this. He negotiated that instead of going to prison, his jail sentence would be served on his own private island. So they gave him the island of Elba. And what did Napoleon do? He becomes emperor of the island. He organizes all the locals into work details and builds infrastructure, roads and bridges and ports. He improves the quality of the island. He also organizes his own navy and has them build a port and ships. Once they built the port and ships, he trained them as sailors, and then he got on board one of the ships and sailed away at night. So Napoleon returns to power and terrorizes Europe for 100 days until Waterloo. And then he's captured again, and that's the end of Napoleon. But this is why he was on the tear for 100 days. This is why a new leader is judged by their first 100 days. It comes from Napoleon's 100 days in 1814. John Dillinger, you're looking at him on the left, public enemy number one. You all know him. After a murder and crime spree, he was ultimately caught and jailed in Indiana, where he fashions a fake gun, paints it with shoe polish, and holds up the guard and manages to bluff his way out of the prison. Now, if you're America's most wanted, basically serving multiple life sentences or death sentences, and you get out, you're going to go and hide. Not Dillinger. What did he do? He went on another crime and murder spree. The scorpion is a scorpion for a reason, right? And he gets caught and killed. At the bottom right, you're looking at Stalag Luft 3. This was the infamous Nazi prison camp. Did anybody see the fantastic movie, The Great Escape? Anybody? Okay, yeah, The Great Escape, good. This is the inspiration for The Great Escape. Roger Bushnell, that was his name, the British officer who organized it. They dug 3 tunnels out of this Nazi prison camp to escape, and over 70 men managed to make it out. Tragically, all but 3 were captured by the Nazis and killed. So that was a remarkable prison break. The prison break we're going to look at also had multiple tunnels, but a way bigger and a way more successful prison break. And in the middle of the screen, you're looking at Alcatraz. Anybody been to Alcatraz? Yeah, to the Rock. Great tour, legendary place, right? The Anglin brothers and Frank Morris managed to tunnel out of Alcatraz and use rain jackets to make a lifeboat. Now, to make the story all the more compelling, they escaped from an inescapable prison, but they were never found. Did they drown in San Francisco Bay? Did they make it? We don't know. Maybe they're part of My Health Angel today. Who knows? So they escaped. The story we're going to talk about is set in a civil war, 1861 to 1865, Union versus the Confederacy. The story we're going to look at comes from a wretched, legendary prison in Richmond. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. The first capital was in Montgomery, Alabama. But Montgomery was so far away from the fighting, so far away from the North, and quite frankly, in the middle of nowhere. There were no major water, rail, or road access points into Montgomery. So they moved it to Richmond. Richmond is closer to all the fighting in Virginia and Maryland, close to the Union border. Plus, Richmond had 5 railways, went to Richmond, roads, and of course, the James River, one of the most important rivers in American history. The James goes from Richmond 60 some miles southeast to Williamsburg, and therefore it has access to the Chesapeake Bay, which gives it therefore access to the Atlantic and to the world. So they moved the capital to Richmond. The prison we're going to talk about was the most high-profile prison of the war. If you could take a time machine and go back to the 1860s, Nicole, everybody heard of this prison. And it was sort of like a hushed tones when you would mention it. It was seen as haunted. It was seen as a wretched place where death was the only answer. So kind of like a scary version of Alcatraz. However, in subsequent years, the prison and the story have all but been forgotten. They don't make textbooks. It's not into a movie. It's not in poetry. It's not in song or verse. It's one of the most remarkable events in American history has been forgotten. So that was the reason for working my butt off for month after month to write the book. So here we go. 620,000 Americans die in the Civil War. 620,000, everybody. That's more than the total number of Americans who died in World War I and World War II put together. The Battle of Gettysburg, over 51,000 casualties in 3 days. in a farming community in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's early July 1863. Think about that, over 51,000 casualties. That's more than the American losses in Korea. That's just about what we lost in Vietnam, only in 3 days in the Civil War. And of course, Gettysburg being the pivotal conflict where Robert E. Lee and his army of Northern Virginia actually made it into the North, into Pennsylvania, which was the Keystone State. And from Gettysburg, Lee could have gone to Harrisburg, the capital, where I was born, and then could have gone to Philadelphia, the most important city, then gone to Baltimore on the turnpike. There was a turnpike then, which was the most important port, and then into Washington to capture, kill Lincoln, and that would have been the end of the war. Thank God Lee lost to General George Meade and the Union Army of the Potomac. So 3 southern states, and I listed them on the screen, and 4 northern states, each one lost over 30,000 of its own boys. Imagine that, which means every town and every family felt personally the losses and the horrors of the Civil War. A story that's not often told, over 30,000 quote unquote colored Black troops died during the Civil War, and we often forget that important contribution. If you've all seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, Matthew Broderick, and Morgan Freeman, it's about the Massachusetts 54th, which was the first quote unquote colored unit who served with great heroism. And the movie was reasonably accurate, by the way. Frederick Douglass, the great slave orator, former slave orator, had his own son serve in it. So more men died from disease than died in combat during the Civil War. Now, here's the bizarre thing about military history. Historians are in wide agreement, me included, that the first war where we lost more men in battle than from disease was World War I. So the Civil War was brutal. There I put a graph on the screen for you to show you the total number of American losses. So get a sense of the Civil War. This is our costliest conflict, worse than basically all the rest put together. So just atrocious. Now, not only was the Civil War bad, the worst aspect of the Civil War, charnel houses were the prisons. Brutal conditions in the prisons. You're looking at a Union prisoner from Andersonville. That was in Georgia. Anybody heard of Andersonville? Yeah. This was the worst prison in American history. It was a bloodbath. I say this with all due respect because I've written a book on it and taught the subject for 30 years, but some of the conditions of the prison, some of the images of the prisoners, some of the torture, it reminded me a bit of the Holocaust. Now, don't misconstrue, there was only one Holocaust, but this looks like some of the images I saw from that. So these prisons were charnel houses, as I always call them. So thousands of men, look at this, over 56,000 Americans died just in prisons during the Civil War. This is more than almost every major war in the 17 and 1800s, except the Civil War put together. So this is just unimaginable. Why were there so many deaths in the prisons? Number one, neither the North nor the South believed that the war would last very long. Both the North and the South thought the war would last 1 month. The South said it'll only last 1 month because we have better generals, and they did. They also said, we love to fight, and I think that's true too. So the South thought the war would end in a month because they're ornery, they love to fight, and they have better generals. The North said the war will be over in 1 month because the North had what I refer to as the advantage of the 3 M's. That's more men, more money, and more manufacturing. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was offering only 90-day enlistments. That includes training. So no one thought the war would last long. Therefore, they weren't prepared for a 4-year-long bloodbath with tens and then hundreds of thousands of prisoners. So if you're not prepared for it, there's going to be a death toll. They didn't have enough food, medicine, clothing, trained guards, or even facilities to house all the prisoners. The North was able to build prisons. What the South did was built stockades, just a wooden perimeter, like you would for horses or animals. And they just put the Union soldiers inside the stockade. if it rained on them, if it snowed, if it was cold, if it was hot, if it was bugs, just out in the open. The South eventually just started putting prisoners on small islands like Belle Isle in the middle of the James River in Richmond. And therefore, they didn't even have to build a stockade. They just left prisoners on this island. They were so skinny, so weak, so close to death that they couldn't swim off the island. So the death toll, the numbers were shockingly high. One of the main scourges, one of the main problems to hit the prisons was disease. Both northern and southern prisons were just a pox on humanity from the perspective of diseases. With that many men jammed so closely together during hot summer months and brutally cold winter months, diseases tore through. Elmira, the Union prison in the north, many men, Southerners, died of diseases. Now, we must differentiate between northern and southern prisons. In the north, prisoners died of disease. In the south, Union prisoners died of neglect, no food, no medicine, no water. Also, Southerners tortured and just murdered Northerners, their own brothers. Says something about them, I suspect. But so here's a picture at the top of Andersonville. Look at how crowded it was, everybody. A massive field with tens of thousands of men crammed in to a wooden stockade perimeter. On the bottom is a recreation today of Andersonville. I think I took that picture. So that's what it looked like. So just an open stockade and the men living in mud. Get this, Andersonville was only open for 1 year at the end of the war. And yet 13,000 men died in 1 year. So do the math. This is just unimaginable. There was a little creek that went through Andersonville. And after a lot of rain, the creek flooded and overflowed. It was a small creek. A lot of men drowned. Why? It was so crowded that they had to lie down near the creek. And they were so weak and starved, they couldn't move. They couldn't lift their heads up. And therefore they drowned. There was no bedding. Most men were just lying in the open dirt along the edge of the creek. So that was Andersonville. Here's the prison that we're going to talk about today. It was called Libby. And it was right in Richmond on the legendary Tobacco Row. So Richmond being the capital city, therefore this prison takes on special political significance. It was on Tobacco Row, which is legendary. It was not far from where Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, where his Confederate White House was, where he governed. If you look at the prison on the right side there, everybody, you can see the James River in the background. So it was right on the Kanawha Canal and the James River. The prison's official name was Confederate Military Prison 1. It was nicknamed by the prisoners the Bastille of the Confederacy because it was their main prison. It was also nicknamed the Castle of Despair for all the men that suffered and died in it. It was also nicknamed Rat Hell. If you look at the prison here, you can see on the land side, it's 3 stories. On the water side, the right side, as you're looking at it, it's 4 stories. Underneath it was a dungeon that was in pitch black, and the dungeon was filled with rats, thousands of rats. Pitch black. The men said when you tried to walk in the dungeon, every step you stepped on squealing rats. Also, a sewer ran through the dungeon, so you had open, festering, raw sewage. So it was a wretched place, rat hell, they called it. But the men realized because the dungeon was so wretched, pitch black, rats, sewage, none of the guards would go there. So that's where the men decided they're going to tunnel out from, and they ultimately do. Why the name Libby? Look right smack in the middle of the picture, the exact epicenter of the picture. You see a horizontal white sign on the prison? That sign says Libby and Sons. So the prison was named for that sign. The tents that you're looking at are tents that house some of the Confederate guards. Some of the guards stayed in the prison on the first floor, but it was so foul and wretched, they preferred outside in the tents. Plus, because it was in Richmond, the capital, because it was so high profile, also because the prison did not contain enlisted men, generals, colonels, high-ranking officers, the Confederates wanted extra security so that no one could escape. So now you're looking at the prison from the James River perspective. The name on the top of the screen is John Enders. He's the one who built the prison from 1845 to 1852. For 7 years, he built 3 massive warehouses. If you look close at that picture, you can see 3 connected warehouses, east, west, and center, as they called them. So 3 big warehouses, each with massive open rooms with low ceilings. Enders built it to house tobacco. Of course, the South known for their tobacco and cotton, and most everything would be brought to Richmond by water, by rail, by wagon. And there it would be loaded up in these warehouses and then put aboard ships who would sail down the James River into the Chesapeake and out to the world to sell the tobacco and cotton. That was the plan. Now, in 1852, just as Enders was putting the finishing touches on this factory, this warehouse, the ladder on the roof broke and he fell 4 stories to his death. So it was said that the warehouses were haunted. The warehouses went to his oldest daughter's husband because he didn't have sons. And the oldest daughter's husband dies. So it goes to the husband of the second daughter who dies. It goes to a daughter who dies. So soon they say the prison is cursed. It's haunted. And if you look at that picture, doesn't it look kind of cursed and haunted? It looks like a perfect Halloween place, like a ghost tour. So nobody wanted anything to do with it. The Enders family could not sell or lease it. Nobody wanted to touch it. For years, it sat empty, despite its prime real estate, right on the James, right on Tobacco Row, right in the main city of the Confederacy. Nobody wanted to touch it. Eventually, a man from Maine named Luther Libby and his son George bought it, and they used it as a chandlery. A chandler is like a warehouser for ships. So you could see the ships would pull up, and the warehouse had things like sails and wood and tar and nails and whatever ships needed. Now, the Southerners were so, I don't know, angry and bigoted that they wouldn't do business with anybody from the North. But they leased it to Luther Libby because nobody would buy it and they needed the money. But Southerners wouldn't stop it as chandlery. Only Northern ships would, but he still made a good deal of money. All that changes during the Civil War. You're looking at a picture of one of the actual rooms inside the warehouse. You can see they're spacious rooms, well over 100 feet by well over 40 feet with a low ceiling. No bunks, no beds, no chairs, no facilities, no nothing. So the men had to sleep on the hardwood floor. The windows had bars in them. Each one was about 4 feet high, but nothing covering it. So the cold wind, bugs, the rain, snow would come through the windows, and the men were freezing. In the winter, many men would freeze to death at night. They would count how many bodies were frozen stiff every morning. But it was so crowded that some men were forced to bunk right beside the open windows in the summer or the winter. It was packed. You'd have 1,000 men in a room. So what the men did, the only way that they could lie down and actually sleep without being 2 and 3 high was like newlyweds. They would all spoon. So they would line up in 100-foot long, men to men to men, back to back to back to back, spooning together. A lot of the men were stripped and robbed when they came in, so they were freezing to death. They had nothing to lie down on. They were reduced to human skeletons, skin and bones. So what they would do by spooning together, you could all lie down, plus you could keep warm. Then what they would do is every hour, the Confederate guards and sentries would yell, 2 o'clock and all is well, 3 o'clock and all is well. And the commander of each unit, when they heard that, they would announce to the men, okay, spoon left, 1, 2, 3, spoon, and everybody would roll over. If they were so tightly jammed together that they couldn't move until every hour. So that way, at least you got to move. Plus, if you would just lie on, let's say, your left side all night, because you're on hardwood and skin and bones, you'd have welts on your body, bruises. So by moving every hour, it mitigated that. Also, it kept the men alive. It kept your blood flowing because you moved every hour. Now, in the Holocaust, a lot of the concentration camps had gruesome sayings like work will set you free. Kind of ironic. Libby, this prison, prisoners who went there were met. You can see on the screen. They were met by a line from Dante's Inferno: "All hope abandon, ye who enter." So this scary line met men. Now on the second line, I put robbing, starvation, and beatings. So what would happen is if you were captured, if you were a Union soldier, you were taken from wherever you were captured to Richmond. Libby became the central receiving area for every Northern prisoner, which means tens, if not hundreds of thousands of prisoners went through Libby. So you'd be brought by train to Richmond. Then you had to march down the streets of Richmond and go to Libby, but it wasn't that simple. So for example, the man who dug the tunnels, who organized the escape, his name was Colonel Thomas E. Rose, like the flower, R-O-S-E, Rose. And Colonel Rose was from Eastern Pennsylvania, near where I grew up, and that was Quaker country. Therefore, it was a hotbed of abolition. Rose, his family and neighbors were all anti-slave, so Rose was very open-minded. He became a school teacher like his pop, but he wanted to spread his wings and get out from under his family's, legacy. So he moved to Pittsburgh in the western part of Pennsylvania, which back then was basically the wild, wild west. And he became a principal. Now, Rose is kind of a walking contradiction in that he's this quiet, shy school principal, yet he is a bear of a man. He is a big, tough guy with a beard. He doesn't say much, but he's very powerful and brave. One of the first men to sign up when the Civil War started. He enlists as a private and rises quickly, private, colonel, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, major, and becomes a colonel like that. His men love him and will do anything for him because even though he's quiet and is not one of these vocal inspirational leaders, he leads by example. So if there was a hole in the Union line during a battle, he was the first to run with sword drawn and hand-to-hand combat and plug the hole. He always charged from the front, led from the front, rode his horse from the front. So Rose was brave. The men loved him. He's captured at the Battle of Chickamauga, and he's put on a train, an open train car, to be taken to Richmond. Now, it's nighttime. It's an open car. So the weather's horrible. So Rose jumps off to try to land and run away. He misjudges the landing and breaks his foot and ankle. So he would serve the entire time with a broken, untreated foot and ankle, and he would run from the prison for his freedom with a broken foot and ankle. So Rose is taken to Richmond. Now, here's what happened when you would come to Richmond. You get out at the train station, then you had to walk through the main street all the way to the prison. Local Southerners would line up on either side of the road in a gauntlet, and you'd have to walk between them. They would throw feces, garbage on people, on the prisoners. They would spit on them. They'd run up and hit them with wood, sticks, sucker punch them, stab them. They would, even old women, the prisoners recalled, were screaming to the guards, shoot and kill every one of them. The prisoners thought Southerners were animals, were subhuman. They were so violent and angry as prisoners were brought in. So Rose is taken to Richmond. By the way, I love the city. If anybody's been there, it's a magnificent city. I'll talk about that later. So Rose is taken to Richmond. He and all the men from his unit have to march down the street. Rose is out in front, even though he's on a broken ankle. The men think he's lost his mind because he's just walking, like he's staring straight ahead. If people hit him, spit on his face, he didn't even wipe his face. He just walked straight ahead. What the men didn't know, Rose was counting the number of steps. He was figuring out the streets, the signs, the lamps, the distance, where the guards were, where the pickets were, the defensive perimeters. He was already planning his escape. Now, when they would take you to Richmond, how were you welcomed to the prison? The first thing the Southerners did is they beat everybody savagely. Then they wouldn't feed you or give you water for 24 hours, so you were starving. The next thing they did was robbed and stripped you. They took your clothing, your boots, whatever you had. So Rose was savagely beaten because he tried to escape, and he was pretty famous, savagely beaten yet again. He was beaten after he jumped off the train and ran. He gets caught. and they beat him there. So twice within a matter of days, he's beaten to almost death. He's taken upstairs and put in the prison. So that's how you were welcomed to Richmond. One of the things that scared all the prisoners were the wardens. So these are the two wardens. On the left with the beard, the big guy, was Dick Turner. He was a physically big man who was a strong and mean guy. He would just beat people. So they were afraid of him because of his size. On the right was the warden, Thomas Turner. Dick Turner was the deputy warden. These guys have the same last name, but no relation. Thomas Turner on the right was a real little, frail, weak, sickly guy. But the men were more afraid of him because he was this raw evil. He had this Napoleon thing going on. You can see on the screen, I typed up some descriptions of Warden Commandant Turner from some of the prisoners who lived through this ordeal. Thomas Turner ordered slaves to build ditches all the way around the prison. They filled it with explosives, and he threatened, I'll just blow the prison up one of these days with everybody in it. He also threatened if anybody tries to escape, I'll blow the prison. He would arbitrarily just torture and kill people for kicks. He also had something the men called the Libby Lottery. What this was is he would get, let's say, 6 colonels or 6 generals, and he would have them pull straws. Whomever got the short straw, he would kill. So the psychological torture and abuse, the physical torture, so the Turners were part of the problem. There's Dick Turner, the deputy warden, the big guy, down in the basement. One of the scary things was the dungeon, I told you. Pitch black, rats, feces, sewage, but they had a couple of cells down there, as you can see, and they would put men in solitary, no food, no water, pitch black, overrun by sewage and rats. So that's a way of torturing men. There were, on the screen there, I wrote, there are 2 things that are particularly disturbing, and I apologize, this is kind of gruesome, but propaganda and the Libby Zoo. So the Confederacy and Jefferson Davis decided to use the Libby prison for propaganda. What they did was this: they did not try to hide the torture, the abuse, and everything else. Rather, they wanted to broadcast it. So they announced the death toll. They had a room called the Dead House where they would just line up bodies, and then they would dig shallow graves and just fill them with all these bodies. There was one wonderful story. One guy was so close to death, he was a skeleton. The guards thought he was dead, so they carried him by his arms and legs and threw him on top of a giant pile of corpses. The guy was still alive, so it was outside the prison. So in the middle of the night, he got up and just walked away, naked, freezing, but he made it. So the South decided, rather than trying to cover up the torture and death, we're going to broadcast it. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was a scoundrel, truly one of the worst Americans ever to live. He was mean, lying, narcissistic, cruel. He lacked any sense of humanity or empathy. He was a horrible person. Jefferson Davis suspended all rights in the South. You could arbitrarily be arrested. There was no trial, no jury, no court-appointed attorney. He suspended the free press. So the irony was Southerners complained about Northern persecution, which there was none, but then Davis persecuted them like a dictatorship, but they got to keep their slaves. So Davis suspended the free press and ordered them to report the gruesome details of Libby. And the reason was to scare the hell out of the North so that no one would fight against them. Now, propaganda was not only to scare the North, but also for the South. So the Libby Zoo, the first 2 years of the war, the South was winning the war. But by 1863, middle of the war, the tide had turned. Gettysburg on the Eastern Front, Vicksburg on the Western Front. The 2 perhaps biggest, most consequential battles, Meade and Grant and the Union win both of them at the same time. That's the writing on the wall, beginning of the end. So Jefferson Davis and the Southerners had to convince their civilians, their population, that they were winning the war. They had to convince the soldiers. So here's what they did. They put high-profile prisoners in Libby, generals, colonels, majors, and they would give tours of the prison like a zoo. It was a human zoo. The men called it the Libby Zoo. So Southerners would go through the prison, it would be filled with 1,000 Union generals and colonels, and they'd be lying on their side, half naked, skin and bones in their own feces. And the Southerners would laugh and make fun of them. And the guards would say, you see, that's General so-and-so from Gettysburg. Not too ferocious, is he? We've got to be winning the war. So if you walk through this Libby Zoo and all the men were on display dying and weak, it made Southerners feel like they were actually winning the war, which was just a farce. And of course, people believed the big lie from Jefferson Davis that they were winning, when in fact the war was inevitably going to be lost. So how on earth did the men cope with these conditions? I estimate that there wasn't enough food, enough calories per day to live. So if you didn't eat, you would die. If you ate, you would die, only slower. There wasn't enough water. So if you didn't drink, you would die. If you drank, you would die slower. There wasn't enough healthcare. There wasn't enough anything. You can see the picture at the bottom. To make this escape proof, the Confederates brought in tons of guards to surround it. They also painted the bottom of the prison white. That way, if you're trying to escape and sneak along the wall, you'll be silhouetted against white. So how did the men possibly cope, and knowing they were going to die? Because it wasn't if, it was when, because you weren't getting enough food to eat. Well, the men created what they called the Lyceum. Now, the father of Western thought and civilization was Socrates. His student was Plato, who created the academy, sort of the first university in the West. Plato's best student was Aristotle, who created the Lyceum. So at Libby, you had so many professors, intellectuals, leaders, business leaders, president of Harvard, everybody's in Libby. So they created their own Lyceum. They said they had better classes in Libby prison than in Harvard. Only they didn't call it the Lyceum, as you can see on the left. They called it the Lyceum, because they were covered with lice and vermin. The men said the main physical activity in the prison was scratching, because they were so covered with vermin and bugs. There was no water to clean or bathe and get them off of you. At the top of the screen, I wrote the Libby Chronicle. They actually published a small newspaper. They would steal little bits of paper and a pencil. And the guy who published it, his name was Louis Beaudry from Canada by way of Maine. He lived through this, so he kept the copies of it hidden in his underclothing, and he reprinted it after the war. The men put on, get this, Shakespearean plays and holiday musicals. There were some famous actors and singers and playwrights and directors inside Libby. The talent pool, extraordinary. The only thing is they couldn't sing or speak loudly. They had to whisper all their lines, lest they alert the guards. If the guards were alerted, they would come up and torture the men, but it was worth it to put the play on. They put on classes. They had classes in Spanish, German, Latin, Greek, military history, theology. You had so many intellectuals in there. You also had dozens of leaders from Europe that were so appalled with the South's practice of human bondage that they came to America and fought for the Union. So all of them, there was one named Emmerich Zabad, S-Z-A-B-A-D. He was Hungarian. He was a professor that spoke 5 languages. He lived through this. So he wrote a detailed journal, one of the many I read, which provided day-to-day assessment. So you had these intellectuals like him offering classes inside Libby. December 1863, January 1864. This is when things changed. The Great Escape was February 9th, 1864 at night. So by the winter of 63, 64, the men knew they were going to die. The South ran out of food. They ran out of medicine. The torture increased. The murders increased. The South stopped taking prisoners, as you can see on the screen. This is the Fort Pillow massacre. Southern officers just killed everybody trying to surrender in cold blood. They even killed the people in the town, men, women, and children. The South stopped prisoner exchanges, everything. Why? That man on the left. That's Nathan Bedford Forrest. He would be, after the war, go on to be the founder and the leader of the KKK. Do you remember the movie Forrest Gump? When Forrest innocently says, I was named after a great general. Yeah, one of the most monstrous people in history, another irony from the movie. So Nathan Bedford Forrest is such a bigot. He's angry that blacks are in uniform. Lincoln was using black soldiers. So he decided he would kill everybody. So the soldiers excuse me, the prisoners in Libby now knew they only had days to live. So what did they do? They decided to escape. Here's how they escaped. That's a fireplace in the prison, the actual fireplace. The men took the fireplace bricks one by one apart with a pocket knife, a little jackknife. They scraped the mortar, took the bricks apart, climbed into the fireplace, dug a hole, and fell down into the basement. That's how they would escape. So how does all this happen? Well, the two main men that allowed all these men to escape, Rose, whom I told you about earlier, the big bear of a man, the colonel from Pennsylvania, and his assistant was Andrew G. Hamilton. Hamilton was from Kentucky. He should have fought for the Confederacy because he was from Kentucky, but the South, the Confederates rode through his town and raped and murdered and stole and pillaged their own people, which they often did. So Hamilton was so angry, he decided to join the Union, and he became a mounted cavalry officer. So Hamilton's kind of like MacGyver. He's very resourceful and clever. He's an inventor. So Rose digs this tunnel way underground. It's so deep, so far underground that there's no air, and Rose passes out. And the candle that Hamilton would steal would go out. So Hamilton stole a broad-brimmed hat, got rope and wood, and made the brim of the hat rigid so he could hold it and stand at the entrance of the tunnel and fan air into the tunnel to keep Rose conscious and to keep the candle lit. The other problem was the tunnel was so narrow, there was no way to turn around. So when Rose went inside, he had to back out of the tunnel. That's not efficient when you dig rocks and dirt and you have to back out and hide it. So Hamilton stole a clothing line, a knapsack, and a spittoon, and he rigged up like a primitive pulley. And Rose would fill those things with the rocks and dirt, yank on the rope. Hamilton would pull it out, empty it, hide it, and then yank and Rose would pull it back in and start digging again. So Hamilton came up with all these efficient things. So what Rose did is one night, it was raining and stormy, and the roof had been leaking. So the guards put up scaffolding on the side of the prison, and they were going to repair the roof. But the storm, the lightning and rain came on so strong that the guards ran inside. So there were no guards outside, and they left the scaffolding up. So Rose sneaks to the barred window, and he's such a big, tough guy. He says, maybe I can break the bars and climb out, jump onto the scaffolding, climb down, and walk out. And when he's ready to do it, he can't break the bars, but he's trying. A lightning bolt strikes. It's pitch black night, moonless night. Lightning bolt strikes and illuminates, and there's a face right beside his. It was Hamilton, who had the exact same idea at the exact same time, at the exact same window. So the two of them scared one another, shook hands, and then went back to bed. The next night, Rose is looking out the window all day, and he sees thousands of rats pouring in and out of the sewer underneath the dungeon. So he realizes the sewer goes from the dungeon to the James River. So he thought, if I can tunnel into the sewer, I could swim through raw sewage, plop into the James River, and then run. So the next night he goes downstairs. Since he's such a big, tough guy, he busts the door of the prison, of the dungeon open, and it's pitch black. He's barefoot, stepping on rats, feeling his way along the wall. The rats are squealing. He hears another squeal and bumps into a man. They both scream. It's Hamilton again. Second night, same thing, same time, same idea. So both men shake hands and decide they're going to escape together. So they try to get into the dungeon through the broken door the next night, but the Confederates put multiple bolts on it. So Hamilton says, let's escape from this fireplace I showed you. It's not used, it's unused. There are big black cauldrons, like 6 feet around in front of it. But Rose is so big, he can push the cauldrons out. So they sneak down there at night. Rose pushes the cauldrons. Hamilton, with his jackknife, digs the mortar. They replace the bricks, start digging a hole to plop into the basement. Every morning, after digging all night, they have to sneak back up, replace the bricks, put the fake mortar in. Rose pushes the cauldron back, and they run upstairs. So this is how they're going to escape. They're going to dig all night. The problem is they're not sleeping. So they're close to death, but they know they're going to starve, so they've got to do it. There's a couple men that helped Rose and Hamilton. One of them was Abel Strait, Colonel Strait. He's a big, burly Dutch guy from New York who moved to Indiana. He's a raider. That is, he takes his men on donkeys down through the mountains of Appalachia, and he destroys Confederate train tracks. He disrupts supply lines. He cuts down cables for, wires from the Morse code. So he's captured, and the South hates him because he'd been such a nuisance as a raider. So they put him in one of those dungeon cells. So Rose and Hamilton have to tell straight what they're doing. He becomes one of the escapees, but he's stuck in a dungeon. So Rose and Hamilton, even though they don't have enough food or water to live, they have to split their rations, carry them downstairs even every night, and share them with Straight to keep him alive. But he helps them to escape. Frederick Bartleson helps him. Bartleson has only one arm. He's a colonel from Illinois. He has an arm blown off during the war, but he refuses to retire or go home. He continues to fight with one arm. He's in Libby. Now, he can't dig a tunnel or climb to the dungeon because he only has one arm. But what he does is Bartleson is a poet, and a fine poet. So he writes poetry every day for the men and keeps their spirits up with his beautiful and inspiring poems. Also, whenever a prominent Southerner was captured, for example, relatives of Robert E. Lee were captured, then the South agreed that they would allow a prisoner exchange or letters to be exchanged. So all the men would send letters to their loved ones. Bartleson would write the letters and write the poems for them. So their loved ones got nice poetry and love letters from Bartleson. And the last one, kind of a Shakespeare guy, the last person I want to mention is Cavada. He's from Cuba. He's a brilliant engineer. Cavada moves to Philadelphia and joins the Union because he sees Southern slavery as similar to the Spanish oppression as colonial masters of the Cuban people. So he fights, he organizes balloon units. You know those big hot air balloons? He would fly above the battlefield, and with semaphore flags, he would locate the Confederate Army and tell the Union on the ground where they were. He would sketch the battlefield, come down and give it to a runner to take it to the general. Unfortunately, he was captured at Gettysburg because he's a foreigner, speaks Spanish. He's beaten mercilessly every day in Libby. He can't dig because he's so weak, but he becomes the eyes and the ears of the escapees. Now this is obviously not the tunnel because there were no photos of the tunnel. But over a year, I looked at hundreds of pictures of tunnels, trying to find the one that matched all the descriptions. This is the match, everybody. Rock with some dirt, the same width, the same height, deep underground, no room to turn around, no room to stretch. And Rose was such a big guy, was always getting stuck. No room to fight off the rats that just ran by the dozens over top of you and harassed or bit you. The men just had to bite their lip and then just dig. All right, they had a couple of problems. One, the sewer caved in. When Rose finally digs into the sewer, it collapses and he almost drowns in raw sewage. Horrific. Captain Johnston, one day he's helping Rose and Hamilton dig at night. There's a surprise roll call upstairs. All the prisoners run. Johnston is so far into the tunnel, he can't get out. He's stuck, which means he can never go back up to the prison because they'll know something's up. He has to spend 30 some days hiding in the dungeon, which means he lived in pitch black sewage among rats. One night, the door breaks open and the guards with torches and a bloodhound come into the dungeon. Johnston knows he's done. There's a giant pile of straw and all the rats live under the straw, and that's where they hid all the rock and dirt from the tunnel. Johnston dives into the pile of straw to hide from the guards. Problem is, it tickles his nose, he's going to sneeze. And you know, you can't hold back a sneeze. He's trying to hold back a sneeze. He makes a noise. The guards run over and start stabbing the pile of straw with their bayonets, but they miss him. The bloodhound barks and starts wagging. Johnston's done, but rats run out. The bloodhound chases the rats. The guards think it's rats. They can't stand the smell, so they leave and Johnston lives. The guy on the right is Erastus Ross. He's the clerk of the prison who conducts all the roll calls. The men hated him because of all the roll calls, but here's what they didn't know. He was a Union spy. There was a famous Union spy inside Richmond who helped to put him, Erastus Ross, inside the prison. So Ross was actually covering up the roll calls and doing all he could to try to help the men to escape. So who was this famous Confederate spy that the South was going nuts trying to find? It turned out to be a woman. There she is, Elizabeth Van Lew, Lew. You see her at the bottom of the screen next to her mansion. Her father was from Philadelphia, was probably the richest man in Richmond. If anybody knows Richmond, it's up on Church Street on Church Hill, overlooking the river. House was torn down in 1901, unfortunately. But she lived in a mansion. She had a ton of money left to her by her father. She buys slaves and frees them, and they live freely with her. She was known as Crazy Bet. Why was she called Crazy Bet? Number one, she never married. Southerners thought that was crazy. Number two, she was an abolitionist. She believed in equality. And number three, she pretended to be crazy. Why? She was a spy. No one in the 1860s, especially in genteel Richmond, would expect an older woman to be the spy, especially when she acted crazy. So she and her former slaves, they would bake all this good food. The guards and the prisoners are starving. Everybody's starving. So she would take the food to the prison. She would tell the guards, I'll give you fresh baked goods under one condition. You let me give some to the prisoners. The guards agreed because they were starving. When she would give it to the prisoners, she would hide notes in the food, notes in the bowls, and she was passing all the intelligence and information on to the prisoners on how to escape, when to escape, and where to escape. Go to Williamsburg, because the Union had taken that over. It's only 60 miles from Richmond. All right, there's an artist image of the room with Crazy Bet hiding people. On the right, that's her actual attic, where she hid a lot of the prisoners and then helped them to escape to freedom. A courageous, courageous woman. I'm going to skip through this quickly because I'm almost out of time. You can see the tunnel they dug with just rudimentary implements. Took 38 days to try 3 tunnels before they got it. It was 53 feet long, much, 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 much longer because it snaked and went down and up around rocks and boulders and tree stumps and all that. So the men dug out of there. It was on February 9th, 1864, that 109 men escaped. As you can see from my screen, some lived, some died. Some made it to freedom, some were recaptured. And there is on the left is Richmond on the map, on the right is Williamsburg. You can see the James River runs all the way down, and that's where the men ran for the escape. The first 2 men to escape were Rose and Hamilton. All the prisoners voted on those 2 since Rose did all the digging and Hamilton did all the planning. They made it out, but when the Confederates almost caught them, so they got separated. They run for a week. They're hiding in ponds. They're eluding bloodhounds. They're jumping into stumps. Rose all on a broken foot and ankle. Hamilton is about the first one to make it to Williamsburg after a week. He tells the Union soldiers in Williamsburg that the prisoners are on their way. Be on the lookout. Rose runs for over a week, makes it to the outskirts of Williamsburg. There's a large field. He doesn't want to cross an open field in case if there's spies or guards in it, sentries in it. So he hides on the edge of the fields in the woods and watches the field for hours. Satisfied there's no guards, Rose finally runs. He can see the smoke off the fires, can smell the food, the bacon cooking. He can hear the voices from Williamsburg riding on the air. As he's almost there in the middle of the field, 5 Confederate sentries stand up. Rose gets into a fight with them. He's beating them, but one of them hits him over the head with the butt of the gun and knocks him out. Rose is recaptured. After all that, 38 days of digging, saving everybody's lives, Rose is taken back to Libby, where he's beaten yet again and locked in solitary. Now, Hamilton, who made it out along with several other men, largest prison break in history, Hamilton tells the Union in Williamsburg that crazy Turner, the warden's going to kill everybody because he's so angry he'll blow the prison up. So the Union put together a quick rescue mission. It's called the Kill Cavalry, named for the guy on the top left, General Kilpatrick. So they're going to get men on horseback. They're going to race into Richmond at night. Each man is pulling horses behind him so they can bust into Richmond, have the men get on all the other horses and race out and save them. The man who planned it is on the top right. That's Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren. He was a tall, dashing European. He was the George Clooney of his time. So everybody loved this guy. He planned the mission. Unfortunately, word leaked out. And when the Kill Cavalry races to Richmond, they're surrounded and captured. They are destroyed, most of them killed, including Dahlgren. They captured Dahlgren. They take him into Richmond. And just like ancient Rome, the Colosseum, they tie him up to a horse and drag him through the streets until he's torn apart and dead. Dahlgren only has one leg. He had a leg blown off during the war, but kept fighting with a fake leg. So the South, the Confederates, they hang his body up upside down and his leg into town square so people could come over and desecrate it. In the morning, people showed up in the town square again to do further desecration to his corpse. But the body and the leg were gone. Crazy Bet came down that night, cut it down and hid it. And after the war, she gave it back to family. The war ends in April, right before the end of the war. General Grant surrounded Petersburg and Richmond and defeated the Confederacy. As Lee and Jefferson Davis fled, however, they had this typical view that if we can't have Richmond, no one can, and they burned the city to the ground. You can see on the right, that's an actual photograph. As the people came back to Richmond, they had nothing to do. Lincoln was going to give them favorable terms, but the anger, the violence, the fake, the lies, the misinformation, the South thought the Union was going to do worse things, and they burned it to the ground. There's an image of Lincoln and his little son, Caddy, touring Richmond. Lincoln wants to meet with Lee and Grant, but Lee and Davis, but they're not there. But Lincoln goes to Libby. He wants to see this legendary prison. And when he's there, the crowd yells, "We will tear it down." And Lincoln says, "No, leave it as a monument so that we can remember what brothers do to brothers, what countrymen do to countrymen, the horrors of humanity. It's got to be a living memorial." Here's the 5 men I told you about. On the left by himself with the big beard, that's Colonel Rose, the one who planned everything. Amazingly, even though he was recaptured, beaten again, put in solitary, he lives. He's released and he rejoins the military, fights to the end of the war, rises to the rank of general, spends his career in uniform, a great man. The men begged him, all the other prisoners that lived, begged him to write a memoir about this amazing escape from Libby. He doesn't want to do it. He eventually writes a few pages, and it's understated. He simply says, "I was lucky." Rose is so humble. The good news is because he didn't really say much, all the other men that lived were angry, so they wrote their accounts to give Rose proper credit. The handsome guy on the top right with the stash, that's Hamilton. Hamilton, as I told you, made it to Williamsburg. He goes back to Kentucky. Unfortunately, things aren't good for him in Kentucky because most Kentuckians were pro-South or pro-slavery. So because Hamilton was a hero from the Union, he was treated brutally in Kentucky. One night, it's a beautiful Saturday night, he and some other veterans go to the local saloon. They're sitting on a bench out front of the saloon, having a drink at night, enjoying the weather and telling war stories. A couple of rednecks show up. They recognize Hamilton, so they shoot and kill him. After all that, the guy on the top left, that's Abel Strait, the big burly Dutchman who was the raider. He was in the dungeon. Now he tries to escape. He gets stuck in the tunnel like Winnie the Pooh. They have to strip him down. They're pushing his rear end, pulling his arms. They finally get him out. He's so weak. The only thing he can do is he goes to Crazy Bet's house, where she nurses him back to health, and then she takes him to Union lines. The man on the lower left with one arm, that's Bartleson, the poet. He lives through the war. He gives all of his poems to men who saved the poetry. Bartleson re-enlists, even though he survived the prison and had one arm. At the final days of the war, he's leading his men from the front and is killed. Bottom right, that's Cavada, the Cuban. He goes back to Cuba after the war, where he rises to the rank of general. He's almost a Jose Marti. He's a hero in Cuba who leads the revolution against the Spanish colonial rule. When I was in Cuba, I found Cavada Square, Cavada Road, Cavada Hospital. So he's a hero there. Unfortunately, the Spanish government captured him during the war, and despite Ulysses Grant begging for his release, Spain kills him. Here's a line from one of Bartleson's poems. It's about the horrors of waking up in the morning and realizing where you are and seeing skeletons. And of course, the guards yelling every hour, 3 o'clock and all is well. Ah, is it so, my fellow captives sleeping, where the barred window's strictest watch is keeping, dreaming of home and wife and prattling child, of the sequestered vale, the mountain wild. Tell me, when cruel morn shall break again, wilt thou repeat the sentinel's refrain, all is well. Here's what happened to Libby. They tore it down. They rebuilt it in Chicago as a castle. it became a war museum. And for a few years, it made money. You can see how many bricks, how big it was. But then it lost money, so they tore it down. Unfortunately, they gave away the cannons, the bricks, the wood, everything. So where's Libby today? Who knows? A brick in a farm in Indiana, a brick in an old house in Ohio. No one knows. Here's the inside of the War Museum, which was one of the actual rooms where the men bunked, but it was all given away. Here's what remains of Libby today. I took this picture. It's like a big license plate. If you go to the site of Libby along the James River, there's now, you can see in the background, a really high concrete wall. It looks like those walls on the Florida Turnpike or I-95 when you're driving them. And now there's right to the right of the sign, there's a hole, and I've been there many times. It's a popular trail along the river. Everybody jogs, ride bike, and walks their dogs. It's a nonstop stream of people. And I've asked everybody walking through, have you heard of Libby? No one's heard of it. I point out the sign. Anybody ever looked at the sign? No. And nobody's ever heard of anything. I mean, history's forgotten this. Here's what's interesting. Underneath the ground where I was standing when I took this picture are the bones of countless heroes, all these Union soldiers who died and were forgotten. Guess what they built on top of what was Libby Prison? The Virginia Holocaust Museum. Isn't that entirely fitting? So I went and told the leaders of the Holocaust Museum, guess what's underneath your museum? Bones. Guess what was there? No one had heard of it. No one had any idea. But isn't that, I think it's proper that we've consecrated, we've hallowed that ground with the Holocaust Museum. On the right is the actual key to the prison. On the left is a 4-foot tall barred window. There are a handful of objects. I've gone to museums. These two are from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I helped them with the signage, the information to make sure it was all accurate. This is a statue, a monument to Lincoln and his little son, Taddy, when they came to visit it. And there's a line behind it to bind up the nation's wounds from Lincoln's second inaugural, given days before his death. Here's a famous painting from the prison. It's a beautiful painting, but it's completely inaccurate. The men are clothed. They look comfortable. They look well fed. They're hanging out. They're having a good time. It's not nearly crowded enough. This is a better painting. The men are starving. They're dying. They're weak. They're not all dressed. However, the ceiling's too high. It's not nearly crowded enough, and the men are still too healthy. There's the shameless plug for my book. Just came out. Thankfully, we're nominated for 3 book awards for it, so we'll find out sometime in 2022 how it does. An unknown story from history. I'll simply end by saying this. War brings out the worst in humanity. Every culture, country, and period of time has treated prisoners horrifically. Look what we did in Abu Ghraib. We've done the same. Look what the South did to Northerners. Yet, war brings out the best in humanity. The way that these prisoners somehow endured this, somehow starving and exhausted and tortured, somehow managed to escape is remarkable. And this is the largest prison break in American history, one of the most successful and bold prison breaks in human history. Thank you.